All right, so hello, ladies. Welcome to our very last lecture for AP US Government and Politics. We are going to be talking about foreign and defense policy as our last chapter today. And for homework, I'd asked you to watch this foreign policy crash course, and I think it's really informative. So please make sure that you, if you haven't already watched that you pause this video and watch that first. I'm going to be covering some of the, I'm kind of going to review some of the same material, but then there's also going to be some new material that you'll need this first video to be able to reference. So please pause, watch that if you have not already. That will also help you to answer some of the questions on your worksheet. Okay, so over the past several years, we have moved from isolationism to unilateralism to moralism to pragmatism. And we spoke a little bit about isolationism and where we were after the Great Depression, right? We had our own problems, and this was, the 1930s leading up into World War II. And despite the problems in Europe, the United States said, you know what, we really would like to be able to help, but we have so much going on our own plate that we just can't help. So that was pursuing a policy of isolationism, which pretty much avoided participation in foreign affairs. We moved then to unilateralism, which was when we started acting without a lot of other countries' input or without asking questions of other countries. Then we moved on to moralism, which was when it's the idea that we had a higher standard than other countries, a higher moral standard, and therefore it was our moral duty to intervene in other countries. And it was interesting because there were some issues of genocide in which the United States specifically avoided calling it a genocide because once it was called a genocide, we were obligated to intervene. And so it's kind of an interesting idea that we had this moralistic international policy or foreign policy when we were simultaneously avoiding involvement. Moving on, we also had the last thing was pragmatism, which is taking advantage of a situation for national gain. And we spoke in class a little bit about a recent war or recent involvement in an area of the world where we would have some sort of national gain. And if you'll remember, it was the Middle East. Some people would say that we got involved in the Middle East to help improve our oil supply and dependence on foreign oil. Other people would argue that point, but pragmatism is just saying, well, is it in our best interest to intervene in this other country? If so, yes, we'll do it. If not, then no, we won't. Okay, so talking a little bit about the history of the United States as an emerging power, we talk about tariffs, global trade system in the early years. We had these kind of preferred people that were preferred countries that we would like to trade with. That started to change a bit as it became a bit more globalized, and we realized that we could get cheaper goods from all over the world, compile them into a product on our own shores, and then sell or trade for other completed goods with other more industrialized or post-industrial countries. We talked about the idea of manifest destiny, and this should sound familiar from your U.S. history class, but manifest destiny is the idea that the United States was divinely mandated to expand across North America to the Pacific Ocean. So we had a God-given duty to expand across North America to the Pacific, so all the way out here to California. Then we had something also called the Roosevelt Corollary, and this is really fascinating. It's the idea that it was U.S. responsibility to assure stability in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we actually would topple dictators that were running other countries, and especially if they had kind of anti-U.S. policies or if they were leaning towards fascism or we just didn't like them, whatever the policy was, we said that no, as a it was kind of big stick diplomacy, that it was our job to intervene in those countries to topple that dictator. And we often put in somebody who was there to kind of promote democracy, but also to promote pro-US relations. Troops were sent into places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, and others. So that's a really fascinating story. If you're interested in reading more about that, I highly, highly suggest you read a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Again, I think I've told you about it before, one of my favorite books, and it details this in fascinating detail, the role of the CIA in toppling these dictators. Okay, so then moving on to post-World War I, the League of Nations happened, and you'll remember the League of Nations was supposed to be a precursor to the UN. Interestingly, the US never signed on to it, even though it was our idea, because Congress wouldn't give a 2/3 majority. But the League of Nations was an idea that based on the idea of collective security, that peace would be secured if all countries collectively opposed any country that invaded another. So it kind of set up ground rules and an agreement that if one country invaded another, that the other countries would kind of team up and gang up against that other country. But then the US never joined. So then World War II happened, and again, this is when the United States was pursuing the policy of isolationism, and they were kind of doing their own thing, dealing with their own problems, sending some supplies and funds to the front, to Britain and France to help fight against Germany. But then kind of doing some covert aiding, but pretty much trying to stay out of it as much as possible. And then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and that prompted a very strong US reaction. We've talked a little bit about the Japanese internment camps here internally, especially here on the West Coast, ranging all the way from California up to Seattle. And even here at Tanforan was a former internment camp. And then we spoke briefly about the U.S. response. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and that helped to establish the United States as a world military power. It showed the rest of the world that we had atomic bombs and we weren't afraid to use them. So you better stay on our good side. And in a way, there's the phrase, it's better they don't have to love us as long as they fear us. And that is a phrase that I feel like encompasses U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of World War II. The United Nations was established after World War II, and their goal was to prevent another world war. It was Eleanor Roosevelt's brainchild, which is interesting, and it was actually the very first conference, and it was signed into being here in San Francisco. And the big three were Russia, Britain, and the U.S., and they played a major role in the founding of the United Nations. Okay, Bretton Woods, the IMF, and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods Conference, I had you guys listen to this Planet Money podcast. Please listen to that because I'm not going to go ahead and explain Bretton Woods. So you'll need to listen to that to make sure that you understand Bretton Woods. It's a very interesting podcast. It's only 19 minutes, so I think it's worth your time to listen to that. And it's fascinating as well. It talks a little bit about why things are pinned to the dollar, why currencies are pinned to the dollar as opposed to other currencies. Why not the pound? Why not the franc? Why not the yen? Why the dollar? So it's kind of interesting. Then you have the International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as the IMF. And we talked a little bit about this in economics. But the IMF, their job is to stabilize international financial relations through fixed monetary exchange rates. They set currency rates in terms of gold and the dollar. And then there's the World Bank. The World Bank is an international governmental organization that provides loans for large economic development projects. Their purpose originally was to help the world recover post-World War II. Now they give out loans often to developing countries with lots of strings attached. So they'll say things like, we will give you this loan for $2 million if you improve your infrastructure so that we can build more hospitals, and you build more hospitals so that your birth rate, your survival birth rate will go up. So things like that. So it comes with strings attached. The goal is to increase economic development of these uh, developing countries. Okay, next we have the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. Again, these are all terms that should sound familiar from your world history class and your U.S. history class. The Truman Doctrine was the U.S. policy initiated in 1947 of providing economic assistance and military aid to countries fighting against communist revolutions or political pressure. So you'll look at the date and you'll see 1947. And this was a really kind of tumultuous time in the United States. Lots of anti-communist sentiment. And then we had the Marshall Plan, which was a European recovery program of extensive U.S. aid to Western Europe after World War II. Very complicated, very controversial. You'll remember that. And the United States here pursued a policy of containment. And what containment was, it was a strategy to oppose the expansion of Soviet power, particularly in Western Europe and East Asia, with military power, economic assistance, and political influence. And one of the ways that we pursued containment was not so great. We started to supply the opponents of the Soviet Union with arms and with funds. And we'll see in the next slide kind of how that backfired a little bit, particularly in places like Afghanistan. So we'll talk about that in a second. So NATO is the first peacetime military treaty the U.S. joined. NATO is a regional political and military organization created in 1950, North American Treaty Organization, I believe, and the United States is much more likely to pursue NATO involvement than UN involvement. We tend not to provide troops, and we provide some funding for the UN. We tend to prefer to go through NATO, especially when it comes to military intervention. NATO is seen as having a little bit more clout and having a little bit more teeth. So moving forward, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I know you guys studied last year, the Vietnam War, which was very controversial, especially in the United States, and then détente, which was the relaxation of tensions between the U.S. and the USSR during the 1970s. Moving forward, we have the Reagan Doctrine, and this is the first in a series of doctrines, and you'll see each one kind of goes along with one of the presidents, and it has to do with what their foreign policy was like. So we'll start with Reagan, and the Reagan Doctrine was a policy that the United States would provide military assistance to anti-communist groups fighting against pro-Soviet governments. So this is really fascinating. This is where the United States provided arms to anti-Soviet movements in Afghanistan, Angola, Mozambique, and Nicaragua. And ultimately, this backfired pretty extremely. So we ended up supplying the Taliban with United States weapons so that they would go fight against Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And then fast forward about 30 years, and the Taliban was using those very same weapons against the United States in the war on terror and in the fight against Osama bin Laden. And so that happens kind of time and time again. Supplying the enemy of your enemy does not always necessarily mean that the enemy of your enemy is on your side. So there's that phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that I don't know that that necessarily works when it comes to foreign policy. Next, we have the Powell Doctrine. And this is actually not a president. This has to do with Colin Powell. And it was a kind of all or nothing approach. He advocated the use of overwhelming force to ensure a quick and decisive victory and the adoption of an exit strategy prior to any intervention. Colin Powell was kind of arm in arm with President Bush and part of his cabinet. And so you'll see that he was as a close advisor to Bush. He had significant power over U.S. foreign policy in the early 2000s. The 1990s and 2000s. So we have a couple of next policies: engagement, enlargement, NAFTA, and the WTO. Engagement is just from Clinton, and it's the idea that the U.S. would stay engaged in international affairs. It's kind of the opposite of isolationism. Enlargement is the idea that the U.S. would actively promote the expansion of democracy and free markets throughout the world. And this is interesting. You could see this as both a good thing and a bad thing. It depends on how you feel about democracy. That's a whole nother conversation, but one I would like to have briefly in class. Globalization of trade just led to enlargement in a way, because we have trade with so many different countries now. There's bound to be some trade of ideas as well, including ideologies. Next, you have NAFTA. We talked about the North American Free Trade Agreement. Remember, that's the deal between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. We talked about the tortilla crisis last semester in economics. So we have NAFTA, and then you'll remember there's also CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. That was just, it includes Mexico and all of the Central American countries, and they're kind of trading down to the south. And remember, while that does allow countries to trade tax-free between one another, it also does drive down prices, especially for small-scale growers. Then we have the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and now we have something called the TPP, which you guys all learned about last semester, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A very controversial global trade deal. Okay, the war on terrorism, 2001 to the present. We have something here called the Bush Doctrine. It was a policy advocated by President Bush of using preemptive military action against a perceived threat to U.S. interests. And this happened post 9/11, which kind of gave, and remember that was the taking back of government power. Previously, we had been kind of, up until 2001, there had been a policy of new federalism where power was slowly going towards the states. And then after 9/11, it all got quickly grabbed back by the federal government, and in the kind of name of the war on terror. So post 9/11, there were weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and I have a very brief YouTube video about terrorism.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course.
And so this is a crash course video. It's your favorite. This guy's John Green. So I would ask that you watch this. It's 15 minutes long, so I'm not going to play it for the video. But you can just see, you go to YouTube, Terrorism, War, and Bush. You do need to know this for the test, so you do need to watch this. Please make sure that you do. Okay, now moving on to the executive branch and foreign and defense policy. Okay, so the president uses authority to order U.S. armed forces to engage in actions without seeking approval from others. He's supposed to ask for congressional approval in advance, but he doesn't always. And he or she has exclusive sources of information, including things like Department of State diplomats, military attachés working for the Department of Defense, CIA agents, and technical means that others do not have. Then we have the Department of State and the Department of Defense. The Department of State is responsible for implementing U.S. diplomatic policy. It employs more than 30,000 people who gather information on foreign, political, economic, social, and military situations, represent the U.S. in negotiations in international organizations, staff U.S. embassies and consulates in more than 180 countries, and manage numerous international assistance programs. It includes the Peace Corps, disease prevention abroad, economic development, and representatives to the UN. So if you're ever in a foreign country and you lose your passport, you'll know that you have to go to the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate to go get a new passport. And that is probably going to be most of your interaction with the U.S. State Department. They're the group that issues a passport. So if you've ever gotten a passport, you got it through the Department of State. And then, interestingly, when I was graduating from college, there was a job fair, and the Department of State was there recruiting people to work in their foreign embassies. And it's something that I was really interested to do. And it was kind of cool because the job description was really vague, but ultimately, what I figured out they wanted people to do is in international newspapers. So, say you're stationed in a foreign country. What you had to do is monitor international newspapers and look for anti-US sentiment. And if there was any, what you had to do is then plant an article with pro-US sentiment. So your job was to promote pro-US sentiment abroad, which is kind of our, as a representative of the United States, that was your job. And it was a really cool job, and that would have been part of the Department of State. I have a couple of friends who are diplomats. One is a diplomat to China, and he gets to travel the world. He's stationed in a new part of the world every couple of years. But generally you become an expert in one or two countries if that's what you want to do. So he's pretty cool. Okay, so next you have the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is responsible for implementing U.S. military policy. That picture up in the top right-hand corner is a picture of the Pentagon, thus named because it's in the shape of a pentagon, as you guys know. It contributes to policy formulation and provides the forces to undertake military operations. So you'll see a couple big things here. These are names that you probably already know, but it directs U.S. forces from the Pentagon, including the National Guard, civilian employees, active duty and reserve personnel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is probably a phrase that you know, and they are the important advisory body to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the NSC, the National Security Council. They provide a link between senior civilian leadership in the Department of Defense and the professional military. So that's really helpful. It's the people that implement defense policy and the actual military themselves. The groups that make up the Department of Defense include the NSA, which gathers intelligence from electronic and other sources. There's the joke that the NSA is always listening to us. Then you have the CIA, which collects and analyzes information necessary to meet national security requirements, the Central Intelligence Agency. And then we also have the NSC, which advises the President on foreign and military affairs, and that's the National Security Council. The Department of Homeland Security is another cabinet department that was created after the 9/11 attacks to coordinate domestic U.S. security efforts against terrorism. It was created by executive order after 9/11. So before 9/11, Homeland Security did not exist, and it was tasked with detecting, preparing for, preventing, protecting against, responding to, and recovering from terrorist attacks against the United States. You guys are probably most familiar with the TSA. Every time that you go through the airport, you go through the Transportation Security Administration. That's why we have to take off our shoes at the airport. Thanks, TSA. And you have to do things. They also have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. If we had an earthquake, FEMA would come in and provide assistance. However, in the next slide, you're going to see an article about their kind of mishandling of Hurricane Katrina and some of the problems that came out of the mishandling of that. And this is what often people complain about, the bureaucracy. And FEMA was kind of Katrina was a huge failure on FEMA's part. You also will see the Customs and Border Protection. So those are the people that guard the borders. If you've ever driven down to San Diego or along the border with Mexico, you'll notice that you have to go through customs and go through the border. That's through the Department of Homeland Security. It's also the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and Immigration Services and Enforcement. Okay, so here is a brief article called The Shaming of America. Hurricane Katrina has exposed both personal and structural weaknesses in America's government. And it's a pretty fabulous article because, sorry for the slow Wi-Fi, but it discusses a little bit about why FEMA failed. And you'll see that some people claim that there were racial factors, and others say that there was just total disabandonment of people who were poor. There are some less wealthy areas of New Orleans, and people said that because of that, people were prioritized differently. But then I think the largest realization was that there was government's failure to bring assistance to its people at their time of greatest need. And most people say that it was FEMA's fault. This is a really fascinating article, and I encourage you to read it. I posted a link to it on Schoology for you to read through it. And you'll see, after September 11th, Mr. Bush poured billions into creating the Department of Homeland Security, but the department has flunked its first big test. It is a bureaucratic monstrosity that includes organizations as different as the Coast Guard and the immigration authorities, and spends most of its energies in perpetual reorganization. The department's focus on fighting terrorism has also distracted attention from coping with natural disasters, reducing the Federal Emergency Management Agency from a cabinet-level agency into a neglected stepchild. The best illustration of this is its own boss, Michael Brown, who spent 9 years at the Arabian Horse Association before finally being eased out and joining FEMA as general counsel, brought in by its previous head, his college roommate. So this is and again, they talk about such political terms like pork barrel spending, and I'd really advise you to read this practical application. In fact, we're probably going to be reading it in class on Wednesday. Okay, moving back. So Congress is the second most important branch for foreign policy behind the executive branch. And the congressional leadership, Congress has the power to develop and implement policy. And that's actually not very well known because they tend not to exercise this power very often. However, the kind of most famous time when they did exercise that power was in 1957 when Congress created NASA, in space, to counteract Sputnik, which I know you learned about last year. Some of you asked to review congressional oversight, and this would be an important slide to pay attention to if you were the person that asked. Congress has oversight of, and it kind of provides a check against the executive branch, particularly in foreign policy. Congress has the ability to oversee appointments, appropriations. Remember, appropriations is budgeting money, and the War Powers Act. And I'll go into that next slide. And they conduct hearings on foreign and defense policy, and to have the president and the CIA inform congressional committees about covert operations. So treaties and executive agreements, the Senate has the power to approve treaties, but remember that the president has a kind of a workaround of getting around the Senate by engaging in executive agreements, which is just that gentleman's agreements with other countries, or those gentlemen's agreements with other countries. And however, when a treaty is actually necessary, that's when the Senate has the power to approve it. Having a treaty rejected by the Senate is kind of a public relations nightmare for the president, so they're pretty rarely rejected. He only puts something to Congress if he knows it's going to pass. Congress also has oversight in terms of appointments, as you guys are seeing now with the judiciary, but also in terms of foreign affairs. Senate has control of advice and consent for appointments. Individual senators can hold up the confirmation process if they don't like a nominee. And in this case, you're talking about the nominee for generally for foreign affairs. So Secretary of State, for members of the cabinet, Secretary of Defense, those type of people. You also have Congress has control over appropriations. And remember, appropriations is money, so it's the budget, and it influences when and where the U.S. fights through its control of the budget. While the power to go to war is shared by the executive and the legislative branches, the power to actually appropriate the funds belongs to the legislature alone. And it's a very carefully used power. So if the president decides he wants to go to war, he can't go to war without money, right, to fund an army. And so this is where Congress has a lot of power over, as a great check over the executive branch. Okay, the War Powers Act of 1973, you must know this. I'm pretty sure that it's going to be on the exam, so I would be sure that you're very clear on what this is. And what this is it was passed by Congress in 1973, and the president is limited in the deployment of troops overseas to a 60-day period in peacetime, which can be extended for an extra 30 days to permit withdrawal, unless Congress explicitly gives its approval for a longer period. So again, it's another check on executive power. Its goal is to prevent future interventions overseas without specific congressional approval, and you'll note from the date that it went into effect after Vietnam. The president is now required to consult with Congress before deploying American troops into hostile situations and to report to Congress within 48 hours of deployment. The president can, however, respond to an emergency, such as rescuing endangered Americans, but could not engage in a prolonged struggle without congressional approval. So he has a little bit of leeway to rescue endangered Americans, but most of the time he really needs to be asking Congress for almost permission to go to war, which makes sense, so you don't have a dictator, right? Okay, it's also important that we touch on the military-industrial complex that the United States has, and that is a grouping of the U.S. armed forces and defense industries. There are major concerns that the defense companies would combine power with the armed forces and essentially get too much power, that they would have lobbyists, and that they would even, and this has actually been shown, there are companies like Blackstone, it's either Blackstone or Blackwater in Iraq, for example, that was contracted with the government as security forces, and they did some kind of sketchy things to get Congress to choose them and major defense officials to choose them as the security force in Iraq. Another major military company is Lockheed Martin. They produce a lot of the fighter jets and helicopters and arms that the U.S. military uses. They are massive, massive, multi-million, billion, trillion-dollar contracts, and the United States spends more money on the military than on education and healthcare combined. So many people would say that we have a little bit of a spending problem when it comes to the military, and some would say that we have almost an obsession with the military. The media has changed. Now it is more critical of government foreign policy. It used to just be kind of a check the box. Media would support U.S. foreign policy, and that has changed. Although now there are lots fewer outlets that have foreign desks. So only organizations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the really major ones have foreign desks, but not as many as used to. It used to be that almost every newspaper or radio or media outlet had a foreign desk or somebody stationed in a foreign country really on the ground. Now what you'll see often is stories are kind of regurgitated, where they'll have one person in that country with the story, and it gets repeated in many different outlets. The public is, in general, more concerned with domestic affairs than foreign affairs. They're just more concerned with their taxes and how high their taxes are, and their healthcare and their day-to-day life than with foreign affairs. Although there is a small, very vocal minority that tends to be a little bit more concerned with foreign affairs. And you saw that really with the war in Iraq, with people who were protesting the war in Iraq. Terrorism brings us to our last slide, and I think it's important to touch on terrorism as a kind of more modern phenomenon, It is a huge transnational challenge to peace. The United States is exploring both unilateral and multilateral action against terrorists, as we're seeing in places like Syria against ISIL and ISIS. You'll see that the United States is acting alone with military intervention, but they're also working with other countries to try to form some sort of coalition that could intervene in Syria for the Syrian people. It's going to be really interesting to see where we go next with foreign policy. Are we going to continue being a superpower? A lot of people say that the age of American superpower is over, and that there no longer are superpowers. The United States is not as well respected or as feared as it once was. And so what does that mean for what's next? Terrorism is really effective against big countries, and so it's a little bit scary seeing where we're going to go next in terms of foreign policy and trying to prevent terrorism from striking close to home. So hopefully that was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can comment on the video or ask them in class. I can't wait for you guys to take this AP exam. You're all going to rock it. And hopefully I will see you all soon. Thank you.